A lot of architects end up. I mean, people from my batch, they've moved into UI UX design and become UI UX designers. How do you think the design of UI, like Utsav mentioned and Sean mentioned in virtual or XR in general, how do you think our role is going to be important as architects uh, in designing or making sure that that interface is you know as intuitive or how do you think an architect's role is uh, when we're working with XR? Cam, you've got yeah.
I mean, I try. I agree with Utsav. Like, I think the the best user interfaces are almost the lack of a user interface. Like, the idea behind mixed, well, lots of different terms that all are roughly talking about the same thing on the XR spectrum. But I've always thought about the mixed part of mixed reality being that the environment is more intelligent. Like the environment can respond to your actions and it has some understanding of what it is, as opposed to just being digital content which is overlaid on the environment itself. And so the architecture of designing the interface, I think, is really about having interfaces that are subservient to whatever the function of the application or tool or game or whatever it might be is. Um, the idea that you can just reach out and grab something or reach out and touch something, and it responds as if it was a physical thing, as opposed to just putting up 2D panels and interacting with them in the same way that you do with a keyboard and mouse.
I think to add to that, definitely architects as designers, they have a slightly better advantage than UX UI designers when it comes to creating interfaces or creating experiences in XR. Primarily because most UX or UI design or even the developers, they're used to a 2D mechanisms, side scrolling or top down approaches. And most of whatever has been developed so far has been like that. And that's where I think architects have this special ability to think between different scales. Most often we look at a paper and then we understand the scale of that space, and then we immediately know how it's going to be in the site, and we immediately know how it's going to look in a screen or an A4 or an A0 sheet canvas. So that's sort of an ability that gives you an innate special power, I feel, to create or to sort of curate your experience in XR. Although it's still not been harnessed to the fullest potential, only now architects are slowly gaining awareness in the space. But there is certainly a lot of room to explore, because even creating signages in a building is something that we are kind of familiarized with during the process of learning. And even just having those visual cues in the XR space takes some sort of an intuition, takes some sort of an understanding of three dimensionality and how people engage and interact. That those are such attributes which we can bring into the spectrum, and we can add a layer which gives us an edge over the other disciplines.
Absolutely. Look, so in my quest to better define what I was working on,
Yeah.
I often said architecture is basically three-dimensional UX design, right? Architects are 3D UX designers.
Yeah.
I mean, what you're doing is you're just designing towards how a person is going to feel inside of a space when they first enter it, how they're going to foresee the utility of certain things that you put in. I mean, architecture by itself is UX design as a course only in 3D, not in 2D. So I'm not surprised, Praneeth, when you say that a lot of people from architecture are going and becoming UI and UX designers. Those skills are already collected and built in 3D. over the period of whenever you're learning. You know how to address a brief. You know how to answer a few very specific points. I want the person to think this, and I think in 3D it's a more complex brief than it is in 2D. Because of course the vocabulary of the 3D space is something that's largely different, and as architects we tend to pick this up without really, without really realizing that in the end you are designing for a person, you are designing for a user. I'm not so fond of that term, but you are designing for a user at the end of it, right? If you're building, so it's and you're optimizing for his or her experience. So it's something that we do, and when it comes to the entire UX of two-dimensional, screen layouts or anything. I think the translation of 3D to 2D is something that is an interesting space by itself. Even if you were to go out and see the latest UX trends, right? A lot of them talk about neumorphism, which is basically trying to make things look 3D. Like a lot of them are already attempting, because you have the concept of layers already, which is the only 2D way to have depth, right? So they have depth in it. So already a lot of those concepts translate beautifully. And as architects, of course, you do have an edge, like Sean was saying, in basically going out and addressing a lot of these briefs. And yes, and then going by Wamsi's point, that also makes you a lot more adept at being able to design for XR, because it's more natural, it's easier to think up spaces and foresee what specific things. And then Cam, I couldn't agree more when you said that the space needs to become intelligent, and each and every object in the spaces that we're designing in XR needs to be, needs to have the intuition that comes out. And good UX is the lack of a UI, right? Like, I mean, that's definitely one of the most important highlights that needs to come into all UI UX. And and it's natural that UI UX by itself as a field is translating into 3D. But if the 3D UX designers come into it, it's a happy marriage.
I think what's quite interesting about that is, like, I guess the way that I always looked at it is, like, our city, like, if you just think of spatial computing in general, like, the city becomes your interface. Like, I don't think we're going to have, or I would like to hope we don't have simple two-dimensional geometry, like, stuck on top of architecture. And that's the way that we communicate information. I think there is far more intelligent ways and more exciting ways of doing this. Like, if we're able to harness 3D spatial technologies in like a unique way to transfer that information, like whether it's, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example, but just imagine like moving through the city, like the kind of information that we could actually perceive or be directed to you. Like at the moment we receive mostly like text information, but maybe there's a way to communicate that through spatial moves, like can the architecture do something that actually communicates the necessary information to us, like where we go, how we move through the space. I don't know, can we dial into different types of spaces as well as we move through? And I think it's a really nice way of looking at it, that I guess architecture is UI UX. And I think the dangerous thing is of like UX developers coming into our space. And I think the worry, I guess from my point of view, is that architects are like, I guess we are all on a relatively similar page, but not many others are. And I think that's what's quite worrying, I guess, for the architect, because I feel like we're always moving relatively slowly in terms of everything in the world. So it's a case of, okay, at what point can architects actually get the head up, like how much faster can we get to actually start outlining our kind of, I don't want to say demands, but like our suggestions on the city, like what happens when Facebook takes over and basically starts running the way that we experience space. Like that's quite daunting, I think. And I think things like urban planning or most architectural experience will be mitigated by some sort of digital mixed experience. And I would say that architects and other 3D designers or developers or game designers need to work together to facilitate the way that we actually experience space, because I think it could be quite a dystopia, I guess, if we leave it to Facebook and Apple. Like, it might be nice.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Actually,
but I think it would be strange if like architects just yeah let it happen.